Hi everybody. If you've been following along with my videos for a while, you've probably noticed that the kind of cooking I like to do involves a lot of experimentation and customization, not too much precise measuring. But baking is a much more precise science, so it's important to follow a recipe, especially if you're making something for the first time. I don't understand all the chemistry behind the magic of baking, so I'm not going to do too much tinkering in this video. But the good news is that there are tons of recipes from knowledgeable bakers available out there online and in cookbooks, and there are ways to substitute ingredients in to customize them if you can't find exactly what you're looking for. So even if you're avoiding animal products or gluten in your diet, there's something in this video for you. There are also ways to make recipes more nutritious and reduce the amount of saturated fats or sugars if you want to. One thing I like to do consistently is use whole grain flours, whether wheat or gluten-free. Whole grains include more elements of the plant, which adds fiber to what you're cooking. And according to the Mayo Clinic, fiber actually helps you feel satisfied, which is an important cue in any mindful eating practice. I've chosen 6 recipes to highlight today, and I've linked to where you can find them online in the video description. So I definitely recommend checking those out, as well as the bakers who came up with them. They get increasingly more decadent as we go along in this video, so there's plenty of variety to try out and something for any meal of the day. I hope you enjoy! First up is a breakfasty loaf featuring applesauce and oatmeal, and I'm going to replace the eggs with flax to make it vegan. Eggs are commonly used as binders to help hold everything together in baking, and the flax is going to serve the same function in this recipe. To make a flax egg, first grind flax seeds into a meal using a spice or coffee grinder. Then mix together 1 tablespoon of your flaxseed meal with 2.5 tablespoons of warm water. This recipe calls for 2 eggs, so I'm doubling that. Let it sit like this for a few minutes to let it thicken. Now we can add our flax eggs into the wet mixture for this recipe, which also includes 3/4 of a cup of sugar, half a cup of olive oil, and 1.5 teaspoons of vanilla extract. We can then set that aside while we mix our dry ingredients, 1.5 cups of whole wheat flour, a blend of baking powder and baking soda using 1/4 teaspoon of each, and a blend of spices using 1.5 teaspoons of cinnamon, half a teaspoon of allspice, and 1/4 teaspoon of nutmeg. Now we're going to combine the wet and dry mixtures before we add in 3/4 of a cup of applesauce and half a cup of rolled oats. And that's it! Now this just goes into a greased loaf pan and spends an hour in the oven on 350 degrees Fahrenheit. When it's done, I recommend trying this with your favorite jam or preserves. Personally, I like it with cranberry sauce. For flatbreads that are great with dips or as wraps, just combine 2 3/4 cups of flour, 1 1/4 cup of plain yogurt, 1.5 teaspoons of baking powder, and half a teaspoon of salt to a food processor or blender. Pulse the ingredients together until they just come together into an initial dough. Next, spread some flour onto a clean surface and turn the dough out onto it. Knead the dough with your hands until it's nice and smooth. Once that's done, divide the dough into the sizes you want and roll each out nice and flat. You can put these on the griddle just like this, but I like to add a little punch of flavor by grinding up a clove of garlic and mixing it into some olive oil and then brushing it onto the top of each piece. Then you can top everything with a nice dusting of dry herbs like oregano. Now, one by one, just flip each flatbread into a skillet heated on medium. Cook each side for about 2 minutes or until you can see a nice toasty brown. You'll start to see some bubbles coming up as you're cooking the first side, which is what you want. When they're all done, you can cut them into wedges, and I recommend pairing them with a warm hummus. For a gluten-free sandwich bread, I'm using a recipe that includes flax as well as eggs. The recipe calls for a small amount of psyllium husk powder too, but I'm replacing that with more flax, which is a similar product, so that I don't have to buy an extra ingredient that I know I won't use very much. So what you see here is 1/4 cup plus 2 teaspoons of flaxseed meal mixed with a cup of warm water. Now we can just combine the dry ingredients, which include 1.5 cups of all-purpose gluten-free baking flour that's designed to work as a 1-to-1 substitute for wheat flour, half a cup of almond flour, 2 1/4 teaspoons of active yeast, and a teaspoon of salt. Then we can add in the wet ingredients, which is 3 eggs, 2 tablespoons of honey, and a quarter cup of olive oil. With all the ingredients added, the next step is to beat the mixture for about 6 minutes. If you've got a stand or hand mixer, go ahead and use that on medium speed since this is really tiring. Now this can go into a greased loaf pan and then leave it be for about an hour so the yeast can work its magic and rise the dough. Then you can bake it for 35 to 45 minutes on 300 degrees Fahrenheit until it's done. And when it's done, I recommend a sandwich with a generous layer of pesto, tomato slices, mozzarella cheese, and a quick douse of balsamic vinegar. I love these sweet potato biscuits. It starts with 1 3/4 cups of soft baked sweet potato flesh, still hot from the oven. When we mix in our half a cup of butter cut into pieces, the heat from the sweet potato will melt the butter into the mix. Then we can combine our dry ingredients, which include 2 cups of flour, half a cup of sugar, 1 tablespoon of baking powder, and half a teaspoon of salt. Slowly add the dry ingredients into the wet. At some point, you'll probably need to start kneading with your hands, and then add in extra flour until it stops being super sticky and becomes more like a ball of dough. Divide and shape the dough into biscuits, and then bake them for 17 to 20 minutes at 375 degrees Fahrenheit. I recommend using these as buns for sliders with a touch of mayonnaise, a bed of sautéed collard greens, and barbecue cauliflower wings. Next up is a decadent brown butter cornbread recipe that starts with melting and cooking half a cup of butter in an all-metal or cast iron skillet or pot. Stir it continuously over medium heat until it's a nice dark brown. Then mix in 3/4 of a cup of granulated sugar and set it aside. Then, in a large bowl, combine 1 cup each of all-purpose flour and cornmeal with half a teaspoon each of baking soda and salt. Now we can add in 2 eggs. And this recipe calls for a cup of buttermilk as well, but I couldn't find that in the store. So I'm going to add a tablespoon of lemon juice to a measuring cup and then fill it with regular milk until I have 1 cup total. Once all of that is mixed together, we can add in our sugar and butter mix and then put everything back into the same pot or skillet. This goes right into the oven on 375 for 30 to 40 minutes. This delicious cornbread goes great with a veggie chili. Our last bread of the day is a zucchini bread that I'm going to make into a dessert. The dry ingredients for this loaf are 2 cups of flour, 1 cup each of granulated and brown sugar, half a teaspoon of nutmeg, 1 teaspoon of cinnamon, and 1½ teaspoons of baking soda. The wet ingredients are half a cup of milk, 3/4 of a cup of butter, and I'm substituting in applesauce for half of that to reduce the saturated fat content, 2 tablespoons of sour cream, 3 tablespoons of maple syrup, 1 teaspoon of vanilla extract, half a cup of coconut oil, and 2 eggs. We'll just add the wet ingredients into the dry and then fold in 1½ cups of shredded zucchini. I've left the skin on so I get all that nutritious goodness into this bread. I'm also adding in a cup each of dark chocolate chips and pistachio nuts for fun. Fill a loaf pan with this batter about 3/4 of the way full and then bake it for an hour on 350 degrees Fahrenheit. I find this bread is really tasty warm with a side of vanilla ice cream. Our zucchini bread brings us to a sweet conclusion for this baking-focused video. I hope you found something to enjoy in here, and if you want to know how to make any of the pairings I've recommended, like the hummus, barbecue cauliflower wings, or a veggie chili, just drop a note to us at the H.E.A.T Center, and I'll be sure to post recipes and demonstrations of those dishes as well. Happy baking, and see you next time for some fun project ideas for kids in the kitchen.